Hi, you are listening to This Is Not Your Practice Life. I'm your host, Macy Renee, and we are going on a journey together, my friends. I'm a certified life and emotional intelligence coach. And if you really want to step into your highest self, there are a few non-negotiables you're going to have to learn, and I am just the person to help you do it. No matter your past, I'm here to help you create a more fulfilling future. So stick around with me. Not only will I teach you how to navigate your brain's daily mind drama, but I'll help you actually understand your mind, your emotions, why you do the things you do, and why others do the things they do. Most importantly, I'll help you build the self-awareness skills to create whatever results you want. It's never too late to change the trajectory of your life. After all, this is not your practice life. Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of This Is Not Your Practice Life podcast. I'm Macy Renee, and I am so excited that you're joining me from wherever you are listening from. If this is your first time joining the podcast, welcome. I hope that you get everything that you came for and more. And if you're a returning listener, you know that I love you so very much. So really quickly before we get into today's topic, I just want to take a quick 30 seconds to say thank you for all of the love and support that I received during my launch of the hybrid experience. It is to date the largest, most challenging launch I have ever done in my coaching career, but it was so fun, and I just truly appreciate all of the kind words, messages, support. So excited for the clients that are getting ready to get started. And I know that several of you had reached out wanting to do the next round if there is a next round, so I will keep you posted. If you go to my website, macyrenee.com, and you click on the hybrid experience page, you'll see a pop-up email box. And I will tell you, it's a special little box that you have to sign up to be a part of, but go check that out. And if you're interested in that, you'll see what it's all about, the details for that. So thank you. All right, let's get started. So for anybody that is new here, if you haven't gone back and listened to the earlier episodes, you may not know my background. Before I left my college career to become a full-time certified life and emotional intelligence coach, I was a pediatric occupational therapy that did early intervention for birth to age 3. So what that meant was I would be assigned children that were at risk of being delayed or already had delays or possibly had a diagnosis of some sort already that would put them at risk of falling behind their peers in developmental milestones. And I would travel to the homes of each of these families and teach the parents different skill sets that were important for their children to have. So it would be things like learning how to use their fine motor skills, their gross motor skills. For about 3 years before they took it away, I was a feeding therapist. So any of you parents out there that have kids that gag when they see certain foods, or they're super picky eaters, or they used to eat everything, now they won't eat anything, I used to address that. I would address their social emotional skills, a trend that has not left me since being a coach. It's one of my favorite things, meaning that I would address any behaviors that they were having when they, throw themselves in what I call a limp noodle on the floor, and the parents start getting frazzled, and the kid picks up on that energy and gets more frazzled, and they don't know how to emotionally regulate. All of the things. We would work on cognitive skills. We'd work on everything. Anything that kept them from living a very typical life. That was the goal of occupational therapy, to address anything that was keeping them behind and make sure that they could operate as closely to their peers as possible and live as normal of lives as possible. So, and anything that kept them from doing that, we had accommodations for. So I did that for 6 years, and I found that my passion, I came to coaching because I was in a really hard place. Occupational therapy, my career as an occupational therapist working in these homes was very triggering for me at times, and I could never figure out why. My body would sometimes go into fight or flight. And so even though I loved what I was doing and it felt very meaningful and purposeful, there were a few things going on. One, I felt like I wanted something different, like I was meant for something different, if that made sense. It wasn't that I hated my career. It was just this inner whisper in my spirit that there was something else for me and I didn't know what it was. And the second thing was trying to figure out why I was so triggered by the work that I was doing as an occupational therapist. I went to therapy my entire life, mostly for 17 years, to address childhood trauma and a lot of anxiety and, just emotions that were hard for me to handle. As an adult, I felt often like I was drowning and couldn't come up for air. So if you are that adult that feels like you're barely blowing bubbles above the surface of a large ocean around you, that's very similar to how I felt. I felt like, where is the life raft or the lifeboat to come and rescue me? And after 17 years of therapy, I was reading You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. And basically, long story short, an acquaintance had told me about this coach that I should, connect with. I told her no. I was strong and in charge of my life. I didn't need any help. That was the story in my brain. And then I was reading You Are a Badass, and the book at one point mentions having a coach when you're struggling. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. Let me just kind of sit on why this keeps coming up in my life. And then funny enough, a few weeks after that, that same acquaintance/friend reached out and said, I know that you said no to, getting to know this life coach, but she just started a free Facebook group. And it won't hurt to be in there if it's something you're interested in. She does free Facebook Lives all the time. You might find it helpful. And I finally got off my high horse and allowed myself to be vulnerable enough to be put in that Facebook group. And the long story short of that is that is how I met my very first coach. It's how I became exposed to the coaching world. It absolutely changed my life. It was what I felt I had been missing in understanding myself at a very deep level. And I worked with my coach personally for 2 years, working on healing a lot of the things that I felt trapped in whenever I would go in therapy. And it actually made a huge difference in my life, so much so that within those 2 years, I started thinking, I believe that this is my life's purpose, that I want to help people come to this kind of transformational work the same way that it's been done for me. And it felt like the thing, like that longing, that whisper that I had had on my spirit for a long time. It finally felt like that is the thing. After trying 100 careers, 100 career paths, it felt like it was coaching that I landed on. And a lot of times in coaching, I bring a lot of my occupational therapy experience in, because working with families so closely, I had probably over 400 families over the course of those 6 years, if not more. And some of them I had every week for several years. Some of them I had, a few times a month for just a couple of months. And so I learned people really well. And I was able to observe a lot of different family traditions and family life and how different families operated and handled things with their kids, and I was able to really see also what the parents were struggling with. And a lot of times when they would have this over stimulating amount of stress, it was due to the emotions that they had not allowed themselves to feel either. So all of that to say, for today's episode, I want to talk about how to help your kids emotionally regulate. We're going to go back to the OT days, how to help your kids emotionally regulate, especially if you are still working on this skill as well. I want to help you understand more about this and give you some tips to get started. So this has been a requested topic from more than one person, and I want to kind of address it from both what's going on with maybe your child and what's happening inside of you and how we can move forward. So it might be a little bit of a longer episode, but just hang in there with me if you notice that you're struggling with this. So let's start with the children part of emotional regulation. The first thing that you have to understand is that emotional regulation is taught. It is a skill that has to be taught. It is not naturally ingrained in us to know how to self-soothe. You have to teach a child a lot of times how to self-soothe if they haven't figured out how to do that on their own. So children are looking for guidance. They're little sponges. The first 7 years of life, their brain is literally, quite literally, based on the frequency of their brain waves, a sponge. Everything that they hear matters. Everything in their environment matters. Every way that you respond to them matters. Now, all of that to say, I know that parenting is stressful enough without you also freaking out about whether you're doing things right or wrong. I know all the time moms talk about, am I doing it right? Am I doing enough? I'm a horrible mother, or like just all of the limiting, yucky beliefs that come in motherhood. And I want to give you some encouragement that I swear by, and this is the truth. In serving over 400 families as an occupational therapist in their homes, in their environment, literally seeing them at their best and at their worst for 6 years, okay? I can tell you that every single parent parented differently. I can say that with 1,000% certainty. There is no handbook of how to do it right or how to avoid doing it wrong. There are definitely skills and things I've picked up on that I can teach you, but I will tell you to just give yourself grace, that remind yourself you're doing the best that you can. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're steps ahead. If you're listening to any podcast about how to be a better parent or how to emotionally regulate yourself or how to better yourself, you're steps ahead in your awareness of just wanting to do better. So I want you to take a deep breath and not take anything from this podcast as a personal attack. If it feels that way, just observe what happens in your body as we talk through some of this, and don't shame yourself for anything that maybe you recognize you could do a little better, okay? Because again, I served a lot of families. I was in a lot of homes, and it was always mind-blowing to me how no parent parented exactly like the next one, okay? The common denominator that I always saw was love. And other than that, everything else in how people operated was different. That's why mom groups can be so toxic, right? The Facebook mom groups, the reps that those groups have of someone posting a question and being brutally attacked by 25 different answers, right? It's like the reason because everybody parents a different way based on their experiences, based on their traumas, based on their healing, based on a million different things. Okay, so I just want to preface with that. But let's go back to children. Children are literally sponges. So whatever they are exposed to, it's being programmed for their first 7 years into their subconscious programming. If you are becoming aware as a parent, self-aware, right, emotionally regulated, you're going to be able to change and impact the outcome a little bit more than if your kids are already grown, right? They have subconscious things maybe programmed in their system that they're going to have to work through. But even if they are grown up and you're an older adult that has fully raised your kids to be independent, doing this work can still be helpful for them to see that you are growing, expanding. You know, kids are always watching. You are their model. You are their role model, and they're watching that all the time. I have had so many clients who come to me in their, late 30s, 40s, even 50s, maybe even 60s. And they do so much work on themselves, and their kid, who is either a teenager or grown adult, will say, I don't know what you're doing in your life, but you are the happiest I've ever seen you. Or you are shining. Like I see your light for the first time in a long time. I have clients, and I even have people from the podcast message me messages like that, where they watch their parent transform, and it is healing to watch because it was a different experience than what they remember as a child. Okay, so even if your kids are fully grown, just know that the work that you're doing here matters, even if they're past that age 7 mark where a lot of their subconscious has been programmed. So kids are little sponges. Their first 7 years of life, they're like a sponge. You have to help them through emotional regulation. Okay, it's the reason why when you go to a grocery store and they see candy bars or they see toys, and they get so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed because that's what they want. They want the toy, they want the candy. And when you say no, or we're going home, or we don't have time, or whatever adult thing that you say to them, they completely spaz out. Some of the kids you will find throw themselves on the floor. They're screaming, right? They are just completely losing control. You have people in the store staring at you. There's definitely the judgers that think that they need to be whooped, right? There's the other people that are feeling sorry for mom or dad because they're like, oh God, I've been there, I know, right? And then there's the people that are just like, oh my gosh, I could never, right? Like maybe they're like, no kids ever. So you have like a blend of experiences, but your kid is a limp noodle on the floor screaming their head off because they're not getting what they want. And I can tell you that they're not doing it because they're a bad kid. This used to drive me crazy as a pediatric occupational therapist because sometimes one of the skills I would work on with parents is when parents were terrified to leave their home and go to the grocery or run errands with their child. It could be that their child was diagnosed with autism, or it could be that their child just got overstimulated from sensory things, which we're going to talk about in this episode. And outings were a disaster, an absolute disaster. And they would be like feeling like they were imprisoned by having to stay home all day. And so that wasn't always good for mom's mental and emotional health either, or dad. Every now and then I'd have a stay-at-home dad. And it would really be like, oh my God, we're stuck here. Like I have to wait until my significant other gets home from work to leave this house. I'm going to go crazy. And my kid can't emotionally regulate. And it's causing me to not be able to emotionally regulate. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And one of the things that would drive me crazy whenever I would go with a family, we'd go to the mall and do the play place at the mall so kids could learn like social emotional skills with other same aged peers. We'd go to the grocery so that they could learn like what the boundaries were that parents wanted to set and how to manage, behavioral outbursts. And it never failed that whenever a child would throw themselves on the ground after a rule was put in place, or, they were told no, that there would always be that bystander that would be like, And you could just see all over their face that they were thinking like, what a brat or what a bad kid. And it would make me so mad because I'd be like, that person has no idea that this child is just learning how to emotionally regulate. And if the parent also doesn't know how to emotionally regulate, it can't be taught to the kid. So even if mom or dad have the best intentions, but they get energetically flustered by their child screaming at the grocery store, the kid can pick up on that, right? And sometimes kids that are really, really smart will use that to their advantage to manipulate because it's like, oh, because mom or dad freak out and they're not regulating their emotions, if I keep acting that way, they're going to give in and give me whatever I want because they don't want to feel that way. Kids are very smart. They can be really smart and figure out really quickly. And I would watch sometimes parents do this, like be so uncomfortable with the stares and be so uncomfortable with the emotions happening in their body at the store, the feeling of being judged, the feeling of, someone thinking wrongly about their kid, the overwhelm of the, overstimulation of the screaming or the crying and the staring and, the beeping of the scanners. Like, I know there's parents listening to this that know exactly what I'm talking about. And, a mom might completely have a breakdown and just start crying right there in the store. Or she might completely freak out and just be like, get up, whatever, I'll get you the candy bar, just be quiet, like stop it, right? Because she wasn't emotionally regulated. So kids can be clever in how they do this, but a lot of times they just don't know how. And they're looking for someone to hold space to teach them how. But in order to teach them how, you have to be very strong in how you are emotionally regulating as well. And so I would start with the parent a lot of times, right? Like, I get how stressful it is that your kid is freaking out and spazzing out, but let's talk about what's happening inside of you when this occurs, okay? And so while I didn't always go deeply into this as an occupational therapist because the focus was the child, what I will tell you all as the podcast listener working on yourself is that this is why it's so important to have your cup full as much as possible, that you are taking care of you, that the way that you take care of yourself is never a selfish act. Investing in yourself, having therapy, having a coach, learning how to become more self-aware, learning how to emotionally regulate, taking the time to listen to a podcast, read a book, take a walk, take a longer shower or bubble bath, asking for help, getting a sitter so you can do date night, getting a sitter so you can just be alone in peace. I know that for caregivers, that can be a very guilt, inducing thing, especially for moms. You feel like you have to be there with your kid all the time. I get that. At the same time, you can't be the best version of you if you're giving something that you don't have. So if you already don't have the emotional energy and the energy in general, by the time your kid emotionally freaks out, you're going to be overstimulated and spent. Your nervous system will break down, feeling like it doesn't even know where to go and how to move forward. Okay? And usually in those moments, that's whenever you don't parent the way that you're most proud of. It's when you scream, it's when you yell, it's whenever you give in and go against yourself and your own rules. Like, just notice when you have this behavior. Notice that when your kids are not emotionally regulated and they're freaking out. Notice when you start getting agitated. Notice when you start yelling, right, or screaming. Notice whenever your immediate reaction is to either put hands on them or put them in a corner or isolate them, okay? And I'm not judging for any of this. As I said, as an OT, I saw it all. I saw everything. As a kid myself, growing up, I experienced a lot of whenever my family members could not emotionally regulate and I was, testing their buttons because I didn't know how. I can remember distinctly, like, anytime I cried, what I learned in my system, and this affected me as an adult, was I needed to stop crying because it would agitate my family members so much. They get so mad at me if I couldn't stop crying at a decent time based on the event being over, that they would tell me that I was going to get a whooping if I didn't stop. And maybe you've even done this with your kid where you're like, stop crying or I will give you something to cry about. That was the number one phrase used on my sisters and I. And as a result of that, we learned how to shove down the emotion enough to stop crying so that we weren't also going to have hands put on us for being unable to stop. Like, there was never a point where our family members crouched down to our level and said, what are you so upset about? Or how can I help you? Or do you need a hug? What can I help you with? Are you feeling big feelings right now? What has you upset? Or even the teaching moments of, I know that you're upset because you didn't get your candy bar. We can't always get a candy bar whenever we go to the store. And it's okay to be frustrated and upset. It's not okay to XYZ, and maybe it's not okay to kick me, or it's not okay to hit me, right? Or it's not okay to push the cart into something because you're mad. Like, those moments when you're emotionally regulated and you can get down on a child's level and really teach them how to be with it. Not shame them for their emotion, but let them be in it and teach them right from wrong. And a lot of times also when your kid is highly emotional, not a lot of talking is going to be helpful. It's actually going to make things more elevated. When you're in a high emotional state, remember I say this for adults as well, when emotions are high, intelligence is low, meaning your emotional intelligence is not where it needs to be to absorb what you need to do effectively when you're in that high state of emotion. It's the same for kids. When they're in a high state of emotion, everything that you're saying, whether you're yelling or you're trying to be calm with them, is going in one ear and out the other because their nervous system is not regulated. Okay, their emotions are all over the place. So sometimes what needs to happen is giving them the space that is safe to feel without shaming, without judging, without punishing. And if they do something like hit something or throw something or try to, spit or kick or punch or hurt their sibling, that's when their intervening happens. And it can be something like coming in with them very gently, putting your hands on them and acknowledging their feeling, letting them know it's okay to feel, but it's not okay to hit. And I recognize that this doesn't always mean that your kid is going to immediately calm down. It's going to be a practice that they know when they're having big emotions that you are a safe place, not a place where they get in trouble. Okay, so whenever I was emotional and I was crying, I knew if I continued feeling my emotion and expressing it through the tears, through the hyperventilating, like when you keep crying, or the coughing that you get because you're crying, or the gagging that you get because you're crying so hard, I knew that if I continued that, I was going to be in trouble and they were going to withdraw from me. And it wasn't because they were intentionally trying to be mean. I can recognize that. It was because they could not regulate their own emotion of frustration, of being overtired, of not knowing how to make me calm down, of maybe being frustrated that I didn't understand their reasoning because my brain as a child didn't understand adult reasons, just like your children don't always understand the adult reasons, or if they do, they don't like it, right? So their emotions are going to be there. And I knew to shove my emotions down or it was going to be 10 times worse. And then I was going to be more upset. Okay, because I was going to feel shamed and like they didn't, I don't want to be dramatic and say like they didn't love me, because at my core I knew that they did. But I think it creates this programming of like it's not safe to be emotional. And I've watched that in my sisters and I. And so the way that transpired into adulthood was a lot of times not showing any emotion, or holding so many emotions in that one day you just explode, and then all of the emotions for like 10 years come out at someone. And usually it's the least deserving someone, right? It's like the person you love the most or feel safest with that you implode on, like maybe a significant other or a best friend. And sometimes that can create issues in adult relationships. And it wasn't that it was that person that you unloaded on that caused the problem. It was that you never learned how to regulate your emotions. And so then you totally explode on another person who maybe did something very small, right? Or maybe did nothing at all, and your system just feels safe enough to unload. However, that's not fair to them as well, right? So this is why we want to clean all of this up, from us as adults all the way down to making sure that we're helping children learn how to emotionally regulate. So a lot of times when I would come in and kids would get mad, like, any kid a lot of times doesn't love rules. And now a lot more kids, there's a lot of research showing that a lot more kids, people in general, are being diagnosed with ADHD. And they're finding, now of course this is not being posted everywhere, right? But they're finding that it's because there's so many things for our brain to take in, and there's immediate gratification happening left and right. Meaning that we have TV, we have apps on TV, we have iPads, we have iPhones, we have video games, and we live in a world where the internet's getting faster and faster and faster and faster, and we can get instant results. And our brain is being so conditioned to so many distractions and instant results that it is becoming harder and harder to pay attention. It's actually becoming a skill that you would have to practice in order to keep yourself from possibly going down the path of being diagnosed as ADHD, right? Now, there are people who chemically have that, but I think that there are a lot of misdiagnoses happening these days. If I'm being completely honest, I do tend to lean a little crunchy. I'm just gonna preface with that. So if you're not kind of crunchy, then my philosophies and things that I've seen you may not agree with. But I'm just going to tell you that I tend to go more holistic and really try to understand the root of the problem. I always did that with my kids as an OT. I do that with myself as an adult, and I do that with my clients as a coach. Like, what's the root problem? Okay, so if someone's telling me that their kid is bouncing off the walls, they can't pay attention, they're, becoming easily frustrated, I'm looking at root causes. What are they eating, right? Because we unfortunately live in a society where there's so much processed stuff, so many sugars, red dyes, like things that parents are just not well versed in, because we're fed it through commercials, we're fed it through it being normalcy. It's right there in our face. It's sometimes the cheapest thing you can buy. And so we have to factor in that, your diet matters, how much stimulation your kids are getting on iPads, on TVs, on computers, on video games matters, again, because their little tiny brains are sponges, and they're learning instant gratification, and they're also being exposed to more and more adult things. And so that impacts development as well. Okay, so there's multiple things to consider there. And you may see, I think that's why the rise of like ADHD and things are, so prevalent these days, especially reading those studies, is because our brain is losing the ability to really have to think, to really have to slow down and fast. In fact, everything is about speeding up, faster, less thinking, less problem solving. And so when the brain has to do that, it's very hard for it to focus. Like, I know for even me, having the phone for as many years as I've had it, and I didn't get really into phones until I was probably, iPhone. I think my first iPhone was maybe, high school, college. I had a BlackBerry my first few years of college. So it was probably grad school when I got my first iPhone. And just the last maybe, 10 years of having an iPhone, it's really hard for me to sit and read a book. I used to be able to read a book, multiple books, no problem. Now it's a skill for me to sit and actually pay attention. Like, I have to make myself sit there, and my brain is like, we're tired, we need to go to bed, this is not as fun. But if I pull up the phone, I could easily stay up another 2 hours. But if I pull up a book where I have to think and focus, it's not happening, Captain, right? So it just shows like the awareness here is how involved can you be even in stimulating their brain, being there for their emotional support. And again, it's going to be harder if you're not taking care of yourself. So kids that would thrive a lot of times when parents would take my suggestions, not all of them did, and that's okay, because it's hard to take away things that you've been used to doing in everyday life. But a lot of times my kids that would thrive the fastest are kids where TV time was limited, iPad time was basically minimal. It was a treat, right, for maybe a parent to get something done for 30 minutes, but like they weren't allowed to have it all day long. Because the problem also is we truly don't know what it's doing to the brain. There's not a lot of research yet to show what it will do to your brain long term. We don't even know that for us as adults with the phone glued to our hand. And I can be one of the worst ones. Anybody would tell you, right? Like, it's really hard for me. I have to make a conscious effort to stop. So we don't even know how it's impacting our brains. We're starting to see some research. So just think of a tiny little sponge child where this is like crack cocaine, right? Like that is what colleagues and I would talk about, OT colleagues and I when we were in these homes is that a lot of the worst behaviors we would see are the ones that were allowed the most electronics, because it's so stimulating to them. It's mesmerizing to them. There's so much happening in them. You take that away, and it was like a child that had to, come off of something very, very, very addicting. So the more that you're getting them out in nature and stimulating their imagination and, helping them learn play skills, helping them learn social skills, helping them learn emotional regulation skills without the reliance of a device or something electronic, the better regulated they will be overall. Okay, so that's one major thing. I know that may make parents want to punch me because I get that you probably get to have more downtime if your kid is distracted with it. I'm not saying take it away. I'm saying be mindful of how much time they're utilizing it and be honest with yourself about it, and maybe put some structure in place for how much they're able to use it. Because if you think of, and if any of you all are around maybe I'd say 25 and older, we didn't have all that. We played outside until the streetlights came on. We climbed trees. We played imagination. Like my swing set was my pirate ship. I would hang out on that thing for hours. I'd go from swinging to sliding to pretending that the floor was lava. Like I would swim. I would splash pads, sprinklers, again, climbing trees, like riding bikes, all of the things. Like our brain was stimulated in such a different way than the kids today, and even for ourselves today. So that's a huge piece of emotional regulation. So if you're noticing a lot of behaviors in your kids, just ask yourself and be very truthful about how much screen time they're also getting, okay? All right, to switch a little bit from that, I want to talk about the sensory things going on. And again, this is probably going to be a longer episode. So sensory-wise, a lot of times the nervous system being unregulated can be from sensory issues that are going on and they're unaddressed. What will happen, and especially in young kids and toddlers, young babies and toddlers, is that they will try to fulfill their sensory needs on their own. It often looks like negative behavior if you don't know what you're looking for, if you're not trained to see it. And so I would have a lot of parents be like, my kid, I feel like needs behavior therapy. And I'd go in there, and really what they needed was sensory work. Okay, so I'm going to share with you the 4 different types of sensory, I guess you could say sensory personalities you can kind of have. That's not really what it's called. I've been out of OT for several years now, and so sometimes I'm a little fuzzy, but basically there are 4 different sensory types that kids can fall under, adults as well. And the way that I would describe this to a family is I would say, pretend that you're at a concert, okay? You're at a concert, or you like know that there's going to be this rock band concert where the music's really loud, where people are going to crowd surf. And I want you to think of you, for yourself as the adult, which one you probably fall into. You might fall into a blend of more than one. This is possible for kids as well. But I want to show you kind of the traits, so maybe you can recognize this in your kids, and I can give you some OT strategies to help with this, especially if your kid is having trouble with emotional regulation. Okay, so there's a rock concert that's getting ready to happen. It's going to be super loud and super stimulating. One of the sensory types is the seeker. And the sensory seeker is the one that wants to be at the front, closest to stage, closest to the speakers. They might even be the one that is crowd surfing. They are seeking as much sensory input as possible. Okay, they want to be in the loud. They love the lights, the fog, the smoke, like all of it is very stimulating for their nervous system. They can't get enough of it. They are front and center. They are so excited. So that would be a sensory seeker. Okay, the sensory avoider is going to be the person that's like, I am not going to that concert. I would rather rip off my toenails one by one than go to a concert like that. Count me out. They're avoiding it altogether. They don't want to go. They're not going to purchase tickets. They don't want to be there. They already know that they're going to be super overstimulated or overwhelmed, and it's a no for them. Then there is the censor, the sensory censor. The censor is the person that will go to the concert. They'll sit probably further back or maybe somewhere in the middle. They'll enjoy the concert for the first, hour, maybe two, and then they will hit a point where they are overstimulated, they're done, they're agitated, and it's time to go home. And if they don't get to leave and they don't get to go home, they're probably going to start fighting with someone in the car. By the time they get to the car, they're going to want no noise. If you turn on the music in the car on the drive home, they are going to lash out. Okay, so they're that person that can be like, I enjoy concerts sometimes, I'll go, but I want to be home by a certain time and I want silence. Okay, that's the sensory censor. I know that one really well because that's the one that I am. I do well around people for a certain amount of time and then I'm done. And once I'm done, I need to go be by myself. And then the last one is a sensory bystander. This person at the concert is going to be the person in the far back left or right corner. And they're just going to kind of be standing there looking like they're just maybe in La La Land. They're kind of interested in the concert. They're kind of not. They're kind of just maybe like tapping their foot. There's a lot of stimulation happening around them, but they're just kind of immune to it all. It's kind of like, whatever. You know what I mean? Like I could be here. It's fine. It's kind of like they need a decent amount to be stimulated, but they're just kind of there. Okay, so those are the 4 types, and you may recognize which one you are based on that description. This is what happens for your kids as well with sensory things that they have going on. So the sensory seeker, if you have a sensory seeking child, your sensory seeking child, food-wise, is probably going to surprise you when they like spicy or they like sour or they like really pungent, bold flavors, right? It alerts their nervous system. They totally shock you. They like pickles or they like, jalapenos or whatever. They also, activity-wise, are going to be the person that bounces off the walls, that sometimes presents as ADHD, that sometimes I think a lot of times would be misdiagnosed as ADHD. Okay, because they're bouncing on the couch. They might squeeze into tiny little small places, like the smallest of places where they could get stuck. They like sitting there or laying there. They like, being smushed by things. They maybe roll themselves up into a blanket taco, as I would call it. They might tie their shoes really, really tight or, want their hair done really, really tight, like the headband on their hair, or their clothes they might want really tight. And so they're seeking sensory input, right? They're running all around. They're climbing on things. They're jumping from couch to chair to table. They're what you might consider the wild child. And the reason that behavior is happening is because they're trying to figure out how to regulate their nervous system. Regulating their nervous system also regulates their emotions. When they don't meet that, like a certain amount of sensory input, when they do not reach a certain amount of sensory input to regulate their nervous system and their brain, you are going to see meltdowns. Okay, so sometimes this is going to be that they're bouncing off the walls, you're telling them to stop, and then they are losing their mind emotionally. And you're like, what is going on? What is wrong with my kid? Why are you acting this way? They need medicine, right? Like that's the first thing that parents kind of do. They need to be put on something. They are wild. What is going on? And it's like, no, they need sensory input. So what I would recommend is probably an occupational therapy evaluation before anything else to see if they need occupational therapy. There are a lot of strategies and things that can help your kid meet that need to regulate their nervous system. And once they learn how to do that in appropriate ways, which is what I would help as an OT, once they learn how to do that in appropriate ways, then they become a completely different attention-focused kid. Because here's the thing about sensory seekers. If they don't meet their need for sensory input, the input that they're seeking, they will not be able to pay attention. So these are going to be the kids that tend to be in the most trouble at school, okay? Because the parent or the teachers are like, they can't pay attention. They're looking all around the classroom. They're bouncing off the walls. They keep getting out of their seat. They're seeking sensory input to try and regulate themselves. And if they can't figure out how to do it, an adult doesn't see the signs or know how to read the signs, okay, they're going to be labeled as the ADHD or troubled child that has no discipline. And really what they're trying to do in the best way that they know how, because they're a child, is how can I meet my sensory needs? And so if you recognize listening to this that this is your child, again, I would say an occupational therapy evaluation would be really good. And go to Pinterest and look up heavy work activities, sensory seeking activities, and it should give you all kinds of things you can do with your child to help them meet their sensory needs, okay? If you have the sensor child, the child that becomes eventually overstimulated, this is going to be the kid that maybe you're at the playground, you're swinging them on the swing, and they hit a point and they're like, I'm done. And they're agitated and they're ready to go home. Or maybe they're having fun until they're not. And then they're ready to go home. And these are the kids that often become overstimulated and shut down. And they might isolate, they might want to be alone, or they might have meltdowns because they don't know how to communicate, I'm overstimulated. And so for them, it's teaching them how to regulate their system when they feel that overstimulation. The biggest way that I can describe this is like for an adult, when you're overstimulated by the kid crying and maybe your significant other needing something from you, and then the baby starts freaking out, and then your mother-in-law calls, and you just feel like you're drowning and you're overstimulated. This is why filling your cup is so important. The same way that you need to do that is what your child may need. And so sometimes what I would see in multiple sibling households is you would have a kid that, would play with their sibling for a little bit and then all of a sudden isolate and go read a book in the corner, or not want to participate in the family events or the family outings, or freak out if you tried to get them to participate in something because they were done. They're like, my brain's had enough, I'm done. And so if you notice that with a child, just recognizing like, okay, their system probably gets overloaded. What can we help do to calm them? Okay. Let's see, who am I missing? The sensory avoider is going to be your kiddo that is oftentimes just unparticipatory. Like you have to almost force them to engage. A lot of times parents of children with autism and some sensory stuff going on would, see their child as the sensory avoider. They had a hard time socializing. They had a hard time playing with people. They, would become overstimulated and had their own thing that they were doing. And so part of that work was learning how to integrate them and teach them the skill of socializing and, being participatory, but also learning how to let them have enough space so that they could regulate themselves. And then we also have the sensory bystander, and that's kind of the kid that just stands in the corner, is not really going to participate unless you encourage it, and they're just kind of okay with just being there. So I always think of this as like if you're playing a game of kickball, the seeker wants to kick the ball every single time. The sensor might, play a round or two, but they want to be done when they're done. The avoider doesn't want to play kickball at all. They'd rather go do their own thing. And the bystander is just kind of there at the bases. Who cares if they get you out or not? They're just kind of glazed is the way that I think of the bystander. And so with each of these, understanding this can be huge in looking for how your kid operates in the world. And this can be as young as, 2 years old, a year and a half, 2 years old is when I was addressing this with the kids on my caseload. And a lot of times what I would see is either the seeker or the sensor, or they'd be a blend of both. Certain things that we would do would be great and calm them because they were seeking something. And when we found an appropriate way to help them with that, it was fantastic. Other times they would become overstimulated and we'd have to pull back on certain activities that did the opposite of what we wanted them to do. So it's different for each child, which is challenging. Just because something works well with your first kid doesn't mean it's going to work well with your second kid. And that is why the guidance of an occupational therapist can be very, very helpful. And so to wrap this up, I think awareness of yourself as the parent is probably the most important thing. Making sure that you are taking care of you, noticing what's happening inside of your body when you are navigating all of the parenting that you're doing with your kids, because it is a full-time job. So you have to have the ability to pause and check in with yourself of what you're needing. You have to be able to get to the place where you ask for help of some sort, or you find someone who's willing to jump in and help you out, or pass the baton and give you the breaks that you need. Because if you don't, you're going to really feel like you're drowning, and you will not be able to hold as effective space for a child who is having difficulty with emotional regulation. A child is modeling what they see from you. So how well you emotionally regulate is also teaching them about emotionally regulating. I was just watching a video about a little boy. I saved it on my Instagram. If any of you all follow me on there, I'll send it to you. It was so profound. He is talking about how he didn't do a good job with his emotions. I think he's like 3 or 4 years old, and his mom is very well versed in emotional intelligence. I think it's what she does basically for a living as well, as like a therapist, or I don't know exactly her role. But she is just holding the space, and she is talking to him about how, yes, he was really mad earlier and he did cry a lot earlier, and he is doing such a good job communicating what he was feeling and why he behaved that way. And he even says, like, and even when I did this, you still love me. And of course, his mom, grabs him up and she's like, of course I do. I will always love you no matter what emotions you have. And it's just this beautiful thing where the way in which you respond and react even to your child's emotions is such like they are watching that, right? They will one day model that with their own children, whether it's what is wanted or unwanted, right? And so I notice even myself, and it's one of the things I factor in of having children of my own is like, I want to make sure I'm super aware of my triggers, especially around children, of when I get flustered, to make sure I'm not repeating any of the patterns that were instilled in me as a kid, like yelling or screaming or spanking or punishing, right? Like there's a way to discipline. And I'm not judging what your form is, but I think there is a way to do it in a very emotionally mature, regulated way. And I think a lot of times when parents lose their cool and they feel bad later, it's because they were not emotionally regulating. They were not aware of themselves enough. They wanted to make the emotion stop because they felt uncomfortable or flustered or frustrated or angry. And so the child becomes the target of their lack of emotional regulation. Okay, so it's kind of like I would hear things sometimes growing up of like, stop crying, you're giving me a headache, right? Like my emotions were the cause of someone else's discomfort. So I should probably stop feeling emotions because I don't want to cause discomfort. I don't want to be like, this is what the child's mind is. I don't want to be loved any less. Okay, and so we just want to be mindful of this for ourselves, for our kids, and that the more full that you are, the more aware you are, the more that you're actually working through the things that trigger your own emotional responses, and the more you become emotionally regulated, the better you will be at this for your children. And I think, again, if you're listening to this episode, if you are listening to anything on the podcast, you're growing so much in your awareness. If you're coaching, especially with me, because we do this emotional regulation, that's what emotional intelligence is learning how to emotionally regulate. creating the life that you desire to live by regulating your emotions. That is what I do as a coach. So if we're working together, or you are, in any of my programs or whatever, then you are ahead of the game in this. And I think if you continue to do the work, you're going to be just fine. But also what I want to say is that if you listen to this episode and we are working together already, or we will in the future, to address any of the things that you're struggling with in your own emotional regulation, because it will impact the way that you handle the things that your children are having trouble emotionally regulating in themselves. One of the most important things we could ever do for our kids, for our family, for our loved ones in general, is be able to hold space for them, to be honest, to be open, to ask questions, to communicate. And if we're not regulating our emotions, we will become irritated when people ask questions. We will become irritated when people feel negative emotion around us. We won't feel like we have the capacity to hold space. And also, if someone that we love and trust isn't aware of their emotions and doesn't know how to emotionally regulate, so let's say it's a significant other, if they really struggle with their emotions, you might find that you don't feel safe opening up about your emotions because you're afraid of their reaction. And kids are very much the same way, right? They may not want to communicate when they're sad or why they're sad or what's upset them if they're afraid that they're going to be in trouble or be reprimanded or condemned or judged for what they're feeling. And so if you're a spouse and you get, or like if you have a spouse and you are listening to this and you just notice like your spouse wants to talk to you about something, notice if you get frustrated or defensive. Notice if you are being a really good listener and listening without defense, or if you feel a lot of emotions coming up in your body. And notice that, if that is the case, that maybe there's some work you need to do. And also, if it's flipped, right? Do you feel comfortable talking to your significant other about emotions or what you're feeling? Or do you feel like they don't have the capacity to hold it? Because in that case, that's another level of work in learning how to create emotional safety within yourself and finding the people who can hold space for you emotionally if your partner is not that person. Because sometimes we will have partners that don't know how to hold emotional space. They will become defensive. They will feel like they're under attack, right? Like if they haven't cleaned up and healed their emotional stuff, they will not have the emotional capacity to hold space for you. And so you might feel very alone in your relationship. And so with that, it's finding emotional safety within yourself and having that person where you can work through your emotions. You can work through your thoughts with someone who's neutral. And that's where coaching can also be very healing and helpful in having that outlet and that work without having to rely on a partner. Even if you want it to be your partner, sometimes they don't have it because they have to also be doing this work. Okay? So I hope that this episode helps give some insight on how to emotionally regulate yourself, how to emotionally regulate your kids, some things to look out for. I know that it was a lengthy episode, but I hope it was informative. And if you know anybody who needs it, share it with them. If you need any help with this yourself, reach out to me, schedule a consult. It's free. It's 60 minutes on MacyRenee.com. We will discuss different offers that I have and ways that maybe we can work together if we both feel it is a good fit. And I look forward to talking to you. If you need anything at all, just feel free to reach out. All right, bye-bye. Hey there. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of This Is Not Your Practice Life podcast. If you'd like to connect on social media, you can find me on both Instagram and Facebook at Macy Renee Coaching. And if you want to stay up to date on all of my offers, announcements, and inspirational emails, you can join my email list at MacyRenee.com. In addition, if there's a way that I can further support you in your coaching journey, you can schedule a free 60-minute consult at MacyRenee.com anytime you want so we can discuss the best options for you. I look forward to seeing you next week, and I hope you have an amazing day. Bye.